Okay, now a brief talk about nuclear bullets. No, these don't create a giant mushroom cloud when you shoot them. No, they aren't made out of depleted uranium or anything like that. But we'll talk about that. Two big ones here. 5.7 by 28 or 5.7 FN and 4.6 Heckler & Koch or 4.6 HK, also known as 4.6 by 30. Now, these were introduced early 90s. HK took a little bit longer to get to market. P90 hit the market in 1990. What we saw was FN created the 5.7 by 28 bottleneck round. The FN57 pistol, don't confuse 5.7 FN with FN57. That is a pistol, that is the round. The P90 PDW, it's this bullpup thing, and then the PS90. It is a semi-auto only version for sale on the commercial market, and it has things like US law compliant 16-inch barrel. The 4.6 HK developed a pistol that got canceled, never went to market, and the MP7 is currently being used by the German forces. A few others have adopted it as well. Now, for comparison, here is 9x19 Parabellum, the 5.7 and 5.56 round. And just to show you another little view, here is everyone's favorite, the big old 45. So you got a little sandwich there so you can see how it stacks up. It's a lot slimmer. Now, why would some people want the P90? Well, it fires a small diameter, high velocity round. It's got a 50 round magazine. The FN57 has a 20 round standard box magazine, and you can get the larger 30 round magazines. MP7, not as quite as impressive as the 50 rounds, but still high magazine count, and it's a fairly standard conventional submachine gun design. If you're familiar with like the Uzis, that's kind of the layout. P90, it's very distinctive. I don't own one, I don't plan on owning one. I have a friend who's got a 5.7, and that's why I got the round. I'm not going to buy a PS90, so just FYI. Alright, let's talk about some history. Give me a second. Okay, brief history. 1884, French invent smokeless powder, or Poire Blanc, white powder, thus heralding in the modern age of firearm ammunition. 1889, the Belgian government collect a bunch of gunsmiths and gun makers together in Luge and make FN Herstel de Luge. 1906, the 30-06 is adopted by the United States. This will become important in a minute. World War I, some darn fool takes a machine gun and pistol caliber carbine, put them together and makes a submachine gun, or in German, Maschinenpistolen. Now, after World War I, we have everybody searching for a semi-automatic service rifle. 1936, the U.S. adopted the M1 rifle, or the M1 Garand, World War II, the U.S. develops the light rifle carbine, or the M1 carbine. Germany works on the Maschinenkarabiner, or Maschinenpistolen, what would eventually be renamed the Sturmgewehr, or assault rifle. And the Soviet Union develops Optimov. Eventually, in 1947, they will adopt the Optimov Kalashnikov 47, or AK-47. Now, 1949, NATO is formed from the Western Allies. 1954, Armalite is founded. They become major players in the story in a second. 1955, a year later, the Soviet and all of their fellow communist countries in Hungary, Poland, Eastern Germany formed the Warsaw Pact in Warsaw, Poland. The 1950s. NATO is standardizing on a rifle and a round. And the idea is that everyone in NATO will use the same rifle, magazine, and cartridge across the board. So that makes all the logistics simple. Because in World War II, the British with their 303, the Americans with their 30-06, and the Canadians with different rifles, and all this stuff was a logistical nightmare. So if everyone has the same rifle, the same magazine, the same ammunition, it doesn't matter what language the guy next to you is speaking, they're going to be able to hand you a magazine if you say, hey, I'm out. Or you indicate to them, hey, I'm out, they'll be able to hand you a new mag with fresh rounds. Well, what ended up happening was the Belgians at FN, the British came to a compromise and developed the FAL, Fusil Automatique Léger, or light automatic rifle. And they had developed a NATO cartridge. Well, the problem was the US had developed or taken the 30-06 and modernized it and created the 308 Winchester, or the military version at this time was, I believe it was known as the T65. And they demanded everyone in NATO use this. So the FAL was redesigned to be a battle rifle, firing the full-powered 30-aughs, or the full-power 308 round. And then the U.S., there was a gentleman's agreement that if the rest of NATO went along with 7.62 NATO, it made that the standard, then the U.S. would adopt the FAL. Well, the head of the Ordnance Department apparently didn't give a flying bleep, and we adopted the M14, something that we had been working on since the mid-40s. Actually, the early 40s. Magazine-fed version of the M1 Garand versus the FAL. But there was another competitor who does play an interesting part in this story. Armalite created the AR-10, and they entered it into this program. They didn't get adopted, and they only managed a couple of overseas contracts. Some of them were being produced by the Belgians for export to other countries. But the result of that was, when they failed to get a battle rifle, a guy named Eugene Stoner took the AR-10 and redesigned it to be a Sturmgewehr, or assault rifle. And he worked with Remington and their new 223 Remington to create 5.56 by 45 U.S. military service, and in 1964, the M16 was adopted. Hold on a second, there's a part 2 to this history, but there's only so much room on the board. Give me a second. Okay, so part 2 of history. 1960s and 70s, we see conflicts where people using M16s are facing off against communist supplied forces using Kalashnikov patterns, either the AK-49 replacements for the AK-47s or the AKM replacements for the milled receiver AK-49s, or various other countries' versions. 1970s, NATO starts using 5.56 NATO. This version was the FN Herstal SS-109 round that was chosen to be the standard, not the American. The Europeans just wanted to get a little bit of revenge out of this, but petty as that might seem, or inconsequential, they did have to get that in there. 1974, the Soviets introduced the AK-74 in 5.45 by 39. 1970s, one of the major spy rings in the story, led by a guy named Conrad, starts spying for the Warsaw Pact. Him and others are supplying the NATO defense plans and the war game results. They have the NATO's rally points and where they are. Now, 1980s, Conrad and other spy rings are being uncovered and shut down by NATO counterintelligence groups, and NATO intelligence agencies are putting together an idea of what the Soviet war plan is. And one of the things that comes up is the Belgians look at this, and they get a mandate, or they give a mandate to FN to create something to deal with this. So they make the 5.7 FN. 1990, FN releases the P90, and its FN 5.7 pistol. 1991, Soviet Union collapses, thus ending the threat, and meaning that FN now has to make a new market for it. Let's take a look at the situation that really drove the creation here. One second. Okay. In the late 80s, or rather in the 80s, we had NATO in Turkey, NATO in Italy, NATO in West Germany, NATO in Norway, the UK was NATO, Spain is NATO, France is sort of NATO, Canada, the US are all NATO. Then we have the COMBLOC forces. Now, what we see is the big concern everyone has is they know that there's only so many ways an all-out war between NATO and the Warsaw Pact could go down. Either there's a battle for Europe, Reds attack blue, or blue attacks red, or flip the globe around, in the Pacific, there is an invasion of North America by the Soviets, or the Americans and Canadians invade the Soviets and the Chinese, both of which would have triggered the war. And the big thing that would have happened, everybody knows, is nuclear Armageddon. The old film War Game pretty much goes on about how inevitable everybody believed that it would happen if it ever cooked off. That was the only possible result. most planners realize that if they don't the US and NATO realize that if they don't repel and push back the Soviets before the first 48 hours are over of any red attack, they were just going to have to use nukes. It was going to be that. But by contrast, if they attacked, they knew that if there was an overwhelming response by the Soviets, that response would include nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. So, over here in Afghanistan, and a few other operations that the Soviets had done, we realized the first thing that happens is they use special forces and airborne units as the spearhead of their attack. And one thing they learned was these guys were issued soft body armor. Now, what we had learned from the spy rings was their plan to defeat us was to take out our nuclear response capacity. Cruise missile, nuclear tipped artillery pieces, ICBMs, submarine bases equipped with nuclear subs, or any warship capable of firing off nuclear weapons. All of these were the primary target of infiltration Spetsnaz teams and airborne assault. So this guy wouldn't be facing our forces. Instead, what we were concerned about was this sort of battle. The guy with the Kalashnikov versus the constable with maybe a pistol. The gendarmerie with a semi-automatic pistol. Or, even more scary, the bodyguard standing between the political leader and the Soviet agents. So because of this, these guys got re-equipped, or because of this, we designed the P-90, so you can at least sort of see them. Get the P-90 to protect these counterattack and these command and control assets against the Spetsnaz and airborne troops that would have been the very first wave. The idea was that if we can protect the leadership and the nuclear response and put this guy down, the rest of the comm block might chicken out, or at least we would have the overwhelming response with nuclear warheads to deal with them. We would still have the nukes. This is the philosophy. Fortunately, as I said, in 1991, all this became moot because these guys all went home, and most of NATO forces also went home. And everything was nice and peaceful and lovey-dovey, and yeah, I can't keep a straight face while saying that. At any rate, though, you know modern political history, but that was what created the P-90 and the 5.7 FN. Now, After that, we have sent law enforcement into the drug wars. We have sent special teams in to deal with security concerns and terrorism concerns. And these groups have found use for the 5.7. In addition to that, the guys who went back home, some of them started buying the commercial PS90s. Other new people who have come of age are now buying the PS90s. But another thing that's really pushed them is, for years, the big people using the PS90, and were very visibly using the PS90, were Hollywood and Vancouver, Hollywood's northern extension. Shows like, what was it, Stargate, made heavy use of the P90. And because of this, the product is known much wider than it otherwise would. All right. Have a good one.